you learn in that process to take ownership and accountability, because who are you going to blame? If it's broken, it's just your job to fix it. And I think that experience is actually really important if you're trying to be a founder, because that is what a founder is fundamentally. It's who else is going to fix this if not me?
Hi everyone, I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and you are listening to episode 209 of the Startup Playbook podcast, a weekly series where I sit down with successful tech founders, investors, and operators to unpack their journey, lessons, and insights to help current and future entrepreneurs. The voice that you heard a little bit earlier was that of our guest for this episode, Mathew Ellis. Now, this episode is a little bit special because not only is this Matt's first ever podcast interview, but we've also been very close friends since grade 7 in high school. And many years ago, after months of trying, I finally convinced Matt to join as one of the co-founders of my first startup, StageLabel. But Matt isn't on this podcast just because we happen to be great mates, but he is genuinely one of the best software engineers in the country. He is the co-founder and CTO of Kismet Healthcare, a company that's addressing the deep inefficiencies that lie in healthcare and disability services. It's one of the fastest growing startups in Australia, and in a short time have experienced phenomenal growth with a small but high performing team of 30 people and an engineering team of just 5. Through my investment arm at Playbook Ventures, we've been fortunate enough to invest into Kismet since the pre-seed stage and have had a front row seat to their phenomenal growth. And in this episode, we dive into some of the principles behind that growth, including why smaller teams get more things done, the 2 core values that make team members successful at Kismet, why vertical ownership is so important, why every engineer on Matt's team spends a day a month on customer support, and much more. Towards the end of this interview, Matt and I get a bit personal and talk about the growth that we've experienced in all areas of our life. Matt is one of the members of Cohort 1 of the Como Club, where we dive deeper into these exact themes, exploring how to build high performance, not just in your business, but in all areas of your life. All right, without further ado, here is my interview with Mathew Ellis. Hi, Matt. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So for these interviews, I usually have to do a ton of research for each of the guests. I think for this one, I've got way too many stories. I've known you since grade 7, so I think it's more about what is appropriate for this podcast or not. But Matt, for those people that don't have the pleasure of knowing you like I do you want to share a little bit about your background story and what got you here today?
So I met Rohit back in year 7, and as he said, lots of stories, but it's mutually assured destruction, I think. I went to university at ANU and then did software engineering and then started a career as a software engineer and did a lot of startups with Rohit sort of in our 20s that went terribly, learned a lot of lessons. And now much later, I found some success in that space. Co-founded Kismet with 4 of my ex-colleagues from my last job, and I'm CTO and co-founder there.
Yeah, amazing. There's so much to talk about. Maybe, it might be worthwhile like actually going back to high school. Where it all began. Spoke to one of our, for context, we have a group of friends that were like friends through high school that we're still in touch. We do like an annual trip every year. I did post up in the group if anyone had any stories, and I think everyone refrained, probably for good reason. But, I was speaking to B-Joy, who's one of our very, very good friends, and we were talking a little bit about like what you were like in high school. If I remember this correctly, you did computer science, but I don't think you loved that class from memory.
I did, computer science. There's a lot of theory, I guess, you do in these courses. And to me, computing was you sit there, you write code, you build stuff. And then there's a whole academic side to it that I had zero interest in. And as school goes, 80% of your grade was the theory and 20% was the practical part. And I did really well in the practical part and would just barely scrape through the theory. And same story with university, a lot of theory, lots of maths. Somehow managed to get through the maths, but it's only when we started doing actual the practical building of stuff that I was in my element, which is a funny way to teach a skill like software. I think that you focus on theory early on because it will put people off. I think it's changed a bit these days though with boot camps. Like that way of learning is much more practical. I think they've learned that lesson over the years, but certainly when I was in uni, 90% of your grade was just academic, which is not the stuff you use when you actually graduate. So it's a strange structure for teaching a practical skill, I think.
I have this weird recollection of this conversation with you where, I remember you saying like, I'm really good at this, but I don't know if like I enjoy it.
Yeah.
When did that sort of change for you?
Well, it's funny, even in university, about the second year in, I was thinking about changing what degree I was doing because I was worried that in the space of software engineering, you couldn't have enough impact. Like if you're building, apps or websites, they don't matter that much. And I think that view's wrong now. But back then I wanted to do something a lot more meaningful. So I was looking at transitioning into like medical science or something like that, where you're using your hands, you're solving problems for people. Turns out you do get to do that in software. And probably one of the ironies of software too is if you go into big organizations, it can feel like you're not actually doing anything meaningful. And what really clicked for me in my career is when we first started doing startups. My first job out of uni was in the Department of Defense, and it's a big machine. You're a little cog, tons of process, red tape. I left that job and went traveling and thought I was done with software. Like I thought it just wasn't the right career for me. But as I spent a few months overseas, I started writing code again on the side because it was fun. And I went, I don't hate software. I hate the context in which software is usually done. And when I moved back from overseas, it's when I moved to Melbourne and we started working together for free doing startups. But even though it didn't lead to anything in the end, I loved the experience. It actually felt like the right fit. So I've always found that you need to find the right context. The right context for me is when it's small, you can actually build, you don't get bogged down in all the other stuff that stops you from doing it. And the interesting thing is, I don't think that actually has to stop. As you build a company and it scales, if you scale it the right way, you can still be doing that. And that's taken my entire career to realize. I thought there's a process companies go through, they get to a certain size, and the way you work has to change. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's just the natural tendency, but you can fight the natural tendency and you can choose the ways you want to work.
We'll kind of get onto the startup side of things, but, I guess, did you know through like high school and uni that those were the types of things that you wanted to do, like specifically into startups and business? Because I don't really recall us talking about that stuff specifically then.
No, not at all. Like I didn't really know what I wanted to do career-wise. I knew it was with computers. It wasn't until we just happened to try it together. It felt like the right fit because I had control over the stuff I was working on. I could decide how it was going to get built. I think that autonomy to make decisions is what you miss in a lot of your career. And I think there's probably a majority of software engineers never experience that autonomy. They go straight into a big organization. They're a small part of the machine. Some probably love it, but I hated it. And it was really, I think, when we started working together that I first realized this is the right fit. This is the kind of thing I want to do. And I never went back to a big company again after that. The biggest one I went back to was Explore, which was the one prior to Kismet, which was 60 when I joined and about 2,000 when I left. But even then I was struggling by the end because it had changed from that small, we're getting stuff done culture to as a big machine that you're part of, and it's hard to feel like you matter.
I was going to say, like, I remember that it was a process in trying to convince you to join StageLabel as well, because, a lot of the time, especially as a non-technical founder, you're kind of told to go and find technical founders. I was fortunate in a sense, like the company sort of came off the back of Startup Weekend, and that weekend we had like 9 co-founders in the business that sort of whittled down to 3, and then we added you on probably a year into the journey. But I remember I was like pitching you for a long time to come in. What eventually sort of, I guess for the benefit of listeners who are in that position where they're trying to sort of convince someone to believe in their idea and work for free for a while, what was it that kind of like got you across the line, or what was that thought process for you?
I actually don't remember. I do remember you trying for quite a while before I actually came across, but I think the idea itself mattered a lot to me. So finding an idea that you're actually invested in. But what would have pushed me across the line, I think in retrospect, was the volume of learning you get to do in startups, like the speed at which you have to grow and find out how to do things you don't know how to do right now. You can't do it anywhere else. It's the only space where you get to actually just learn on the fly, which is both awesome and terrifying. I remember we had about 50K in the bank at some point, which was the only money we'd managed to raise. And we're trying to figure out what do we do. It's not going to salaries because it's not enough. So what are we going to do with this money to help the business actually grow? And just betting on things and hoping they work out. And most startups do that and most get it wrong. It's kind of thrilling though, to like have to put everything on the line and see if it works. You don't really get that all in. Maybe I'm a gambler. But being able to bet on yourself, I think, it's very rewarding when you realize you can make something happen or not. Like you are the thing that matters the most.
It's that autonomy, like, kind of going back to your early experience as well. Like I remember, again, I was talking to Bijo about this, about your experience with Lockheed Martin, where I think you were waiting for your clearance to come in for a long time. And I remember I think there's this phase in people's life where they're trying to get into the real world and all they're kind of worried about is like getting a job and getting money in. And almost the ideal scenario is like you get paid and don't have to do anything. But when you're actually in that situation, it is the worst thing possible. Like, I think I've been in periods, like limited periods in my life where, had a job, got paid a bunch of money, but like was work that I hated or just wasn't really, I pretty much like felt like it was so easy that I was regressing, and that just kind of drove me crazy. Is that what kind of like what you're kind of speaking about there in terms of, the difference between almost like getting paid and, but, doing something in an area where like you don't really get to do anything and you don't really grow versus like the allure of startups, which is exciting, but also financially very unstable.
Yeah, no, it's 100% what it is. Lockheed Martin, I took 9 months to get a clearance. They put me in an office with about half a day's worth of work to do a week because most of the work they did required a clearance. And I didn't know what I'd be doing once I got the clearance either because they can't tell me. So I'd sit in an office and have to just kill a day, basically 5 days a week. I've never been more miserable in my life. That's what pushed me out of the industry, basically. Then when you come into startups, I'm at a point now I'd rather work for free doing something I like than get paid a lot to do something I don't like. I'd take a pay cut to do something I like. That's not true for everyone, but if you care more about what you're working on, I think you have to find the place that's doing that and just sort of figure out an arrangement that works, because you're not going to be happy chasing money usually. It's table stakes. You're lucky to be in a situation where you can say that. The upside of that career early on was I was able to save some money to do other stuff. And I did a lot of work on the side to try to just get some cash so that I didn't have to go back and do this again. And that set me up really well to move to Melbourne eventually and do some startups for a while when I joined StageLabel and a few other ones after that. So, sometimes you just have to work to make some money so you have options. But when you have options, money is not usually the best thing to be going for. And yeah, that was a pretty defining moment. I can kind of divide my life from a few events. One of them was spending 18 months in a job that I absolutely hated before realizing that it wasn't the field I'm in that I didn't like, it's the context of the work I'm doing. You
just kind of spoke about working on a couple of different things. And I think there's this whole impression that sometimes people get of like people's career being very linear, or kind of seeing like, oh cool, you've kind of like reached this amazing point with Kismet and like all of this sort of stuff was very obvious and clear. I think I remember like even with B-Joy, we were starting like to play around with like random Rombi first steps. There was also, do you remember that like random hackathon weekend that we sort of put together?
Flair.
And was that the like
the messaging, local messaging app?
Where someone in particular was very unhappy because the whole product was if I think this was downloaded on my phone, where if someone called me and I missed the call, it would like send them an automated message saying, saying, oh yeah, sorry I missed your call, like please feel free to book a time in. And particular people in my life got very, very annoyed about that, about that text message. I think there's like a lot of like tinkering and things that I think are just like often overlooked and like not really part of just overall narratives of people's story. But, what were some of the things that you sort of picked up with some of this kind of early days that have sort of stood over the test of time with the stuff that you did at Explore and what you're doing now at Kismet?
Yeah, so you take web development as like a broad area. A lot of those skills are like you learn them, you can reapply them. And what I've always liked in my career, I came in to software engineering, and in my last year of uni, I'd never done any web stuff, database stuff that's like the foundations of an actual career. Didn't do it at all at uni until the last year when you had an option of doing a real world project, which is where I got some actual exposure to this stuff, which is the stuff I actually needed. So Ruby on Rails is a web development framework that's been around for a long time now. And the first time I used it, I realized I could focus on solving a business problem, not trying to make code do what I wanted it to do. So finding a tool that let me get the outcome I wanted without having to fight it was actually a pretty amazing experience, which is what we used for StageLabel as well. But it meant I could focus on the business. What is going on in the business? Figure out how to use technology to enable that rather than making technology the focus. And as I've gone through my career, I've always looked for those sort of, what are the things that are going to let me get to the outcomes quickly? So same process with Kismet, for example, finding the tools that are going to let us focus on the actual business we're trying to solve, not the flashiest tools or the most impressive patterns. It's pretty boring, our tech stack overall. But boring is good because it means we get to focus on actually solving real problems, not how to make our code continue to work long term. That knowledge has been useful. I did a lot of game development stuff early on. The interesting with game development is you have to do everything in the sense you write code, but you have to come up with level designs, you've got to do graphics, you've got to do sound. there's a lot of moving parts involved and you'll have no idea how to do most of them. Like I know how to code, I don't know how to do the rest of that stuff, but it forces you into a position where you've got to keep learning. And I think that is the fundamental key. You want to find jobs that keep you learning. As soon as you hit a point where you feel like you know everything there is to know, you're not going to keep growing. I've been lucky with Kismet in part because I've sort of hit a point in my career where there's not a lot of technical challenges that are insurmountable to me anymore, but there are a lot of leadership challenges. So my growth path now has been less on the technical side and more on that leadership side. Like how do you scale a business? And I've been able to keep growing as a result because there's this whole world of stuff that I wasn't even exposed to until I worked at Explorer, and specifically with Mark. Mark is the person who's helped me like see this whole side of the business. That's a very interesting, so through my entire career, I'd never had a mentor. And I meet a lot of junior engineers these days who are kind of shocked by that fact. But because I worked a lot as a solo developer, I just learned everything myself. And I think where I've ended up is a big part of that experience where I can't rely on anyone else to teach me. I've got to learn. I even remember at StageLabel at one point, I found out our emails were broken. I think I came to you one day and said, hey, none of your emails have been going out for the past week. And there's no one I can blame for that besides myself. So you learn in that process to take ownership and accountability because who are you going to blame? Like if it's broken, it's just your job to fix it. And I think that experience is actually really important if you're trying to be a founder, because that is what a founder is fundamentally. It's who else is going to fix this if not me? Even if you don't know how to fix it, you're just going to have to get in and have a stab. That's the thing I think that shaped my career more than anything. It's having to take that ownership. And as I sort of came back into slightly larger organizations, that sort of thread of behavior, I think, stuck with me. So I'd still come into these organizations, but then be really good at finding the threads to solve and taking ownership of them. And I think that's how I ended up working with Mark eventually, was I was always willing to take ownership and put my hand up to actually solve a problem. And he sort of spotted me doing that and then brought me along on his journey because I was someone who could help him get where he was trying to go as well. And we've had an amazing sort of, I don't want to say codependent. We've been able to mutually support each other really effectively, I think, over the years, just because, you know, when I've got problems, he can help me solve them. When he's got problems, I can help him solve them. And having that person who, so there's a roundabout way of saying what I was saying at the start, I hadn't had a mentor. The first time I had a mentor in my career was not someone technical who could teach me how to be a better programmer. It was someone who opened the door on like all the other stuff, what it means to be a leader. Just a whole dimension. I worked in plenty of companies, worked with plenty of CEOs, and I never was very impressed by them. No offense. No,
if you were impressed by me back then, I'd be worried.
But he sort of made all of that really apparent to me. And I think a lot more about that stuff now than I think about technology. Technology is pretty consistent. It's a tool you apply. That leadership piece is much harder, I think, to get right. And it's endless. Like you never perfect it. And it's interesting. Like it's actually just interesting to learn how to be a better leader. And it's not, when I say leader, it doesn't mean manager. It doesn't mean you've got people under you. It's more like the attitude you bring. It's do you take ownership? How do you handle stress? Are you resilient? Do you model good behaviors for people? Do people respect you and come to you when they need help? That's leadership. Those qualities are the things I think that will bring you a lot of success in life. And I think most of those come from being self-reliant in a way. Like you are able to be the kind of person who looks at problems and go, I'm going to go solve that. You have to learn leadership then to be able to do that, I think. Yeah, learn that skill.
Where did you kind of develop that clarity? Because I remember being over at your place when you were like trying to find the right next step for you. This is prior to Explore. And I remember you having just a ton of conversations. And like, you know, for context, you're one of the best developers that I've ever come across. So I remember you had no shortage of options, but you were always like, I'm just looking for something that will allow me to work remotely. And this is before COVID. So this is not a very sort of common practice. Mark has actually come on this podcast before, and I'll make sure I kind of link that up. And one of the stories that we kind of talk about is how you sort of came on board the company, which was, he said that everyone that had spoken to you about the role said that you were amazing. You had a conversation with him, and then HR sort of came in sort of running through saying, oh, we can't hire Matt because he wants to work remotely and none of our engineers work remotely. We don't have a policy or structure for that. Like, we can't do that. And he just said, essentially, well, if he's amazing, we need to find a way to make this work. And then as it happened, like 2 weeks later, everyone went into lockdown and had to work this stuff out anyway.
Yeah, it was an interesting time. I ended up talking to a friend I had at Explore at the time, and I'd asked, are you doing remote? And he sort of said, yeah, probably. So I went in for an interview. I was one of the few people sort of in Melbourne who knew Elixir, which is quite a niche language, and they were building their product in Elixir. So I was a very good fit. I'd actually done some contracting work for them too before that. So they had like code in their code base they could look at to evaluate me. So in terms of skill fit, I was perfect. And as you said, I went in and said, look, I'm looking for remote work. And the answer was sort of a flat no, we don't do remote. And that was fine. I sort of shrugged my shoulders, went, okay, not a problem. Went home. And then the next day, Mark called me and he's like, what's the problem? I said, there's no problem. I'm just looking for remote work. And his verbatim response was, I don't give a fuck where you work. And I knew from that point on, I was probably going to get on with Mark pretty well because he's just focused on outcomes. And that, again, sort of to my earlier point, is I'm interested in producing outcomes and ownership and that kind of mentality towards work. He clearly was thinking that way too. But yeah, then, the first week I started on the job, they asked if I could come in. This is the engineering team to sort of get up to speed and on board with them. And I had to sort of say, no, if you want to learn how to do remote, you're going to have to figure out how to do that stuff remotely. And they, in fairness, said, good point. And we did it remotely, and within a week or two, I was up and running. Everything was good. And probably another 2 weeks later, the company went into lockdown and every single person was doing the same thing. And to their benefit in that case, they'd had to figure out all those problems now. So as people went and worked from home, we had a head start. Some of those things had been solved. But yeah, it is not to keep banging on leadership. That is what Mark was doing there. He was going, what's the right direction for the company right now? And going against the grain, potentially disrupting what's currently happening. And it was the right call in retrospect too. And this is one of the great challenges, I think, of running a company is you just have to make calls that you think are right. And then people will be upset sometimes you've done that. And if you think it's right, you just do it anyway. And 100% what Mark does to a T. But I think it's the right model of running a business. You have your values, you have an objective view of what you think is right, and you just have to kind of ignore the noise and people being unhappy sometimes and stay on that path. You have to ignore it, which is hard. But I think that's how you find success. You ignore the challenge for people who raise complaints usually is they're not the ones who are going to be accountable for the decisions. So that's the ultimate sort of piece here. If you want to make a decision, you have to be accountable for the decision. Otherwise, you're just input. We'll take it or leave it. But I think people miss that the accountability is the bit that matters if you're a decision maker. If you're making decisions that somebody else is accountable for, you're going to make bad decisions. And I've seen that play out a lot in my career as a whole too. People making decisions that they don't have to wear the consequences of. It's not a good outcome usually. Also, why startups are a great place to learn though, because you're always going to be accountable. When you're in a team of, a CEO and a CTO, technology's broken, who are you going to go to? Need to raise cash, who's going to go do it? You have to be the one accountable for the decisions. And it sucks sometimes because you have to deal with all the problems of the world and you get very little gratitude from people for it. But that's the job. Like you get to get all the accountability and none of the praise.
We're going to take a very quick break from this podcast to talk about one of our partners, Vanta. So if you're building a SaaS business and want to quickly unlock growth and build customer trust, one way to do this is by achieving compliance with SOC 2, ISO 27001, CPS 234, Essential 8, or other in-demand compliance frameworks. However, this process is often time-intensive and very costly. Vanta automates up to 90% of compliance, making you audit-ready quickly and saving you up to 85% of associated costs. And not only that, Vanta scales with your business. With a market-leading trust management platform to help you continuously monitor compliance, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. You can join over 8,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, and Indebted that use Vanta to build trust and prove security in real time. As a listener of the show, you can get up to $1,000 US off Vanta when you head over to vanta.com/demo. All right, let's get back to the episode. Speaking of some of those principles, leadership and finding the right sort of structure and fit, I remember taking you out for lunch when I was early days of my last startup and again, trying to convince you to join was what I kind of walked into that meeting with. And I think that you graciously heard me out and were like, oh, it's not the right fit. But anyways, I've kind of, either way, I'd sort of decided to go again with Mark on this new business. And I was like, I knew that, you were the type of person who, if you got excited about something and, something actually compelled you, it had to be something really interesting. And that's sort of what led to me meeting Mark and us very thankfully being part of your sort of first round of funding. But what did that sort of look like for you from,
I guess like being at Explore to then actually, going back into the founder seat and sort of starting Kismet?
Yeah, so the Explorer exit is interesting because I was offered a position there which would have been really comfortable, good money, like probably pretty interesting work too. And I sort of went, I need the next challenge. I need something bigger than just sort of a business as usual job. So I didn't leave walking into Kismet. I just sort of left that job because it felt like the right time. And within all of a week or two, Mark has gone, I've got this great idea. But at that point, I sort of knew Mark as an operator. Like I knew it would explode if we were both there just doing our thing, along with our other co-founders who came along on the journey. We'd been working together in a small team at Explore and like an incubator type thing. And we went, with us just able to run and do this thing together with no distractions, this will be a monster. So I was pretty much an immediate, yes, let's go try this thing out. Mark immediately sort of went onto the circuit of trying to meet investors. I started building a product, and within 6 months, we'd sort of found our first fit. But the challenge I've always had with engineering, there's a lot of jobs that will pay you really well, would probably be quite interesting technically, but they're in sectors that aren't very motivating. So a lot of gambling, banking, that kind of stuff. It's where all the money is. But right back to the point I made a bit earlier, where at some point I was thinking about changing out of software at university into medical science. I wanted to use the skills I was building to do something that actually was worth like doing, had an impact. And sort of the space Mark's always sat in has been, how do you make people's lives better? It's how do you help people with children, people with disabilities? In Kismet, it sort of hit on what is probably the biggest area you can do that. It's healthcare. That was an instant yes for me. Like you're in the exact kind of space I'd like to work in, so I think it's meaningful. It's the right team. It's the right time. I've got the right skills now to know I can do this as well. That's the other part of this journey that's often difficult, I think, for engineers. You sort of go from this total tangent, sorry, but you start your career as a junior and you're complaining about when you're going to get to mid, when you're going to get to senior. Once you're a senior, you go, well, I want to lead a team. And this is just the normal career progression. You get paid more, I think, is the main driver. It's a bigger title, more money. What people don't understand is writing software and managing people are literally two different skill sets. Like you can do one of those concretely for your entire career on its own. And I think, I don't know how you do this in practice, but we talked about it. The ideal scenario would be that if you want to go into leadership or management, you should take a pay cut because you've never done it before. So you get to the top of your engineering career and want to become a manager. All right, you're back at the bottom now of the ladder. I don't think people would be on board with that, but I think it's the right call. So as I went through that career transition, I sort of had to lead teams as well. At Explore at its peak, I was principal engineer and I was managing sort of a technical organization of about 80 odd engineers, the most senior technical person. I spent all my day in meetings and sort of dealing with people. And as I sort of progressed further, the next step up the rung is director of engineering, see that kind of actual executive technical leader. There's a few layers of those, but that kind of role. And I looked at it and went, I don't know what it takes to have that. So even when I went to the principal engineering role, the role came up at Explore for principal engineer. I looked at it and went, I'm not qualified. I don't know how to do that job. And it wasn't until Mark reached out to me and said, hey, why aren't you applying for this job? That I went, oh, maybe I am qualified. I just assumed I wasn't. So I ended up applying and I was able to do a lot of good work there. But the same thing happened at Explore. This sort of director of engineering position came up and then I looked at it and went, I'm not qualified. And as I actually looked at what that person was doing once I came into the role, I went, oh, no, I can do all those things. I just never had thought about myself doing those things. So when Kismet came around and I had the option of coming in as a CTO, I didn't want to do all those things, to be fair. There's a lot of admin and management. But I looked at it and went, there's nothing magical those people are doing. They're just solving bigger problems potentially. But what they often do, which I think is the mistake, is they're non-technical roles. And I think as I came into Kismet, I said to Mark, look, I can do the job of CTO, but that job doesn't mean I'm managing a huge team of people. It means I'm still on the tools building because that's the thing I'm good at and that's what you want me for. And he agreed. And I sort of said, if what you're looking for is that sort of executive technical leader who doesn't work on things, I'm not that fit. But the realization I had through that sort of conversation was what Mark wanted in a CTO was someone who's on the tools building. You know, they can see the vision, they can execute the vision. You don't have to get off the tools. You need to be able to execute a technical vision. Some people can do that off the tools. That's not a problem. But for me, that is where I sit. I sit on the technical side, the architectural side, understanding how it all fits together and sort of making sure the vision can come together at the end of it all. So that was my role at Explorer and principal engineer too. It's having that sort of master plan. How is everything going to tie together to solve this problem? And I spent so much time communicating that, which was the job. If you keep your team small, which is what I've done in Kismet, I can have that grand vision, but I don't spend all that time trying to communicate it. You spend more time trying to actually execute on the vision, which is, I think, the key. Like, how do you get to that outcome faster? As you're building a team, that's what you're going towards, right? You're not trying to build a big army of people. You're trying to go, what is the right team to get to that vision as quickly as you can? And Kismet gave me a chance to put my money where my mouth was on how you build a team to do that. And I think it's worked really well. And we're actually quite small. We've got our 5th engineer joining after 2 years. And I think we have way more capacity than we need to do the things we want to do, which is awesome. And I spend 0 time managing for the most part because the team just gets pointed at problems and they go solve them. That's the other thing that's a bit interesting with big engineering organizations. I often found that if I had a real problem I needed solved, there are like 3 or 4 people in that entire organization who I'd actually go to when I needed it solved. And the thinking I had with Kismet was, if you could just take those 3 or 4 people and work just with them, I don't think the outcome would be substantially different than we're getting with 80 people. And again, money where my mouth was, I had to try that and see how it went. I think it's actually worked pretty well. So just, it's not just the technical skills. There's sort of a cultural value fit you're trying to find with these people who have the right mindset, which boils down to 2 things. Like, are they humble? Do they want to keep learning? That kind of thing. And do they take ownership? And those are the 2 things I tell everyone we hire them. Like, if you could be humble and you can take ownership, you'll do really well here, because that's what we need.
So many different threads to pull on there. But, I know, like, you and I have had so many conversations about one of the downsides of like a company as it scales, or sort of larger companies in particular, is what you just essentially touched on, which is, a lot of the time the people that are best in their roles in executing get pushed into management roles, which means that they do less of what they're really good at and more of what they're probably not as natural to them, especially when it comes to the technical side of things, which is managing people. It's something that I know that you're extremely passionate about in terms of building a small team. And when I spoke to Mark about this as well, he said that he kind of didn't really believe it when you first told him. He said, kind of sounds great in theory, but like, I don't really know that it works in practice. But he kind of gave you the freedom and the reign to sort of prove that out. And now he's kind of said, having seen that play out for himself, it's just how he sort of thinks about building the entire sort of business and the entire sort of structure around that. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you guys do achieve so much with a relatively small team? Like, for context, I don't know if we can kind of like share specific numbers, but you guys have been an absolute rocket ship. And I think for anyone to sort of look at what you guys have achieved from the outside looking in, you go, oh, surely they've got a team of 50, 60 engineers. Like you said, you've got a team of 5. What does that sort of look like structurally in terms of like how you sort of structure the team and how you are able to execute?
I think fundamentally the way you build high performance is through having a high trust culture where you've got people who you just expect will execute, and they do. And the best analogy I have for this is basically the Navy SEALs, where you've got people who you're sending in who all trust each other deeply and will have each other's backs, and they'll just go and execute. So the first sort of piece is that trust, but they needed to find sort of those exceptional individuals who are actually some of the best in their field. I don't think just anyone can play that role. Like, there's a certain type of personality experience that they have. I always lean back on, like, there's a layer of trust that you need to build with a team, or already have from past relationships potentially, so that you can sort of point them at a problem and know that they're going to be able to go and solve it. And at the same time that they can trust that I will have their back if they run into problems. So it goes in both directions. But to the small teams in general, I sort of found, this is again from Explorer's experience, the challenging part of building software is not the writing code part. There's sort of 2 parts that are hard. It's figuring out what you should build in the first place, and then communicating accurately to people what they need to build. And what normally happens in big organizations is you create layers of people responsible for different parts of these things. So in a normal engineering organization, you might have a product manager, a product owner, a business analyst, designers, back-end developers, front-end developers, database engineers. There's a whole suite of people with like a horizontal slice of responsibility. I think that model is exactly wrong to get good outcomes. I think if you want good outcomes, you have to slice responsibilities vertically. So again, the same sort of point of, you need people to be able to take ownership of something, which means they are talking to the customers to find out what the problems are. They are working with designers to figure out what the thing should look like. They're working with customer support when things go wrong to understand the problems. They're releasing the features into production. They're writing the back end, the front end. They're doing database migrations themselves. They basically have to own a feature from when it's just a problem in someone's head that they're running into through to this thing in production that's deployed. And there's no one who's slicing out and taking part of it off them. I think without that ownership, you start to get people who are adding miscommunication to a process, not on purpose, but every time you have to communicate requirements between two people, something will get lost. So if the engineer is the one who's hearing the problem firsthand and the one who's solving it, they're very likely to get it pretty much exactly right when they actually ship the solution at the end of that process. But what traditionally happens in big orgs, and it makes sense because they're so large, you can't scale that model, I think, indefinitely. They spend a lot more time on planning and trying to figure out how to communicate requirements and upfront design. Everything takes a lot longer to actually happen for one, but when it actually is done, it's less likely to be what people wanted to. So I say this word a lot, but if you build your structures in the company around how does one person take full vertical ownership of a problem, how can they be empowered to actually go solve this themselves, you're much more likely to get good outcomes quickly, I think, than if you've started to build sort of processes and hierarchy and middle management. So the scaling exercise at Kismet's been, how do we keep vertical ownership as we add more people to the team? How do we avoid adding middle management layers that are there for reporting? How do you avoid people who are effectively project managers who don't have any direct outcomes themselves, but they're monitoring others who are doing the actual work? And the way I frame this to people is, you're not a project manager. Project management is part of your job. So as CTO, I project manage. That's part of my job. But I'm not going to split that out into someone else's sole job, project management. I sit with the designers and the product team and just figure out what we actually want to build, go through the designs, review it all, and sort of iterate on that together. I think the key part, though, is that you're not slicing this stuff off for others. As soon as you start to build out a process around things that requires a handoff for something to get done, I would almost bet you're going to get worse outcomes than if somebody was doing that whole thing themselves. So this is challenging to scale because not everything can be done by one person. But you need to start thinking about the work you're doing in terms of how do I give one person complete control of a process as much as possible and make them responsible for the outcome. Because again, if you give them that whole thing to own, but you don't make them accountable for the outcome of that, you'll still get a bad outcome because it's not their problem. So that end-to-end ownership, one of my favorite books is Extreme Ownership by Jocko. Sums up my worldview very well. And I think it's not a complicated book, but the message is, I think, spot on. You need to have that level of ownership across the work you're doing. And you have to look at each part of the business and go, how do we structure this so that there is that ownership there? All the way down to junior employees, people who are just learning. You want your junior engineers to still be building stuff end to end and having that same experience, not sheltering them from the end to end process, which I think is a natural tendency. You shield people from stuff. I think you want to get them involved in the whole thing early on. So, for example, all of the engineering team do a week on support in rotation, and they just have to sit there, answer Zendesk tickets, see firsthand what's coming up. But they're hugely motivated often at the end of that to go and fix those problems. And also the customers get a great experience because you get an engineer seeing your ticket, they'll often get a fix that in the next 30 minutes kind of thing. So if you want delighted customers, get an engineer to see the problems coming out firsthand, and often they're things that are really easy for them to fix. And you get the problem solved, the customer's ecstatic because their problem's been fixed, and you're getting much better outcomes. Whereas your traditional kind of engineering organization will have a customer service team, L1, L2, L3. It'll escalate through those layers, and then after a month, it might get to an engineer. So you're really just trying to short circuit those long processes and go, how quickly can we answer this problem? And you just want to get a team that you can empower to be, we do our planning for the for the week on a Monday. And we just look at a list of stuff we want to work on. There's no estimation. We don't go, this is going to take 2 weeks. We don't go, this is going to take 6 weeks. We just go, here's the thing that's next most important. Who wants to take it? And they work on it till it's done. And if they get halfway through and go, this is actually bigger than I thought it was going to be, we go, well, what's the best version of this going to look like? What's the version where when we release this, we don't have to look at it again for the next year or 2 years. This problem's just solved for the interim. And we try to work towards that. Let's get this to a state where we don't need to touch it again for 2 years because we did it right up front. And that might take longer, but you're sort of empowering engineers to solve the problems they're running into properly. And ultimately, part of that is that they know what the actual hard deadlines we have on certain things are. So they can choose what to work on and prioritize based on knowing what the priorities are, knowing what the deadlines are, but not being told, here's your bucket of work that you have to do. They have a lot more freedom to choose because the trust is there, that they understand the goals we have to hit, the timelines. I don't have to tell them what to work on. I just make sure they're aware of those constraints and they will work to them.
Yeah. Part of having that sort of high performance culture and team is setting that culture and that sort of framework and environment. I think I can see Mark's influence on you in terms of a lot of the analogies that you've got. But, I think specifically around the Navy SEALs, they kind of speak about how they don't just look for people that are high performers. They would rather have someone with high trust rather than sort of high quality, because you can't really teach trust, and trust is the most important thing. When that sort of comes with, you've got the framework in terms of the culture that you've got, I guess the next most important part is having the right people there. And this is often something that, I think a lot of people, especially non-technical founders, really struggle with in terms of knowing, who's the right type of engineer to sort of bring on. So maybe I'd love your perspective on, if there is a non-technical founder that's listening, or someone who is looking for a technical person to come on board, what are some of the things that they should look for and how should they assess that? And then specifically, what is it that you look for and test for when you decide to bring people on?
Yeah, this is probably unfortunately the hardest question to answer even for me, because it's still hard for me to get this right. And the short answer is probably that you're going to get it wrong some portion of the time. So 2 in 3 is a good hit rate for hires. I've relied a lot on networks I've built in my career through hiring, because we're small. I don't need to hire an army of people. And I've got a handful of people I've worked with who I know are the right fit for this. So what I look for, though, these days more than anything is vibe. It's more, do I like this person? Do they seem humble? Like, that's a big one for us. Are they the sort of person who's here to grow and learn? Can they take feedback? The technical stuff, yes, you can assess that. You can send them coding tests. It's easier for me to say as a CTO, probably harder if you're non-technical. The best bet's probably, can they show you things they built from scratch themselves? So like, if they've got startup experience where they've got a product that they've built because they're the only technical person in that organization, that's good. But ultimately, it is going to be a trust exercise for you if you don't know how to evaluate the technical skills. And I'd base it on the kind of human they are. And I think, especially with engineers, good engineers are usually really eager to learn. That's what makes them good usually, because they spend their free time writing code and building stuff, and that's how they end up being good. So if you catch this person who's excited by the idea, they're hungry to learn, they ask good questions, and you think, I actually kind of like this person as a human, I think that's as good as it gets. And then you just have to be willing to actually manage them potentially out of the organization if it doesn't work out, which is another very hard skill set to learn in founding a business, managing people out. But it does require quite a level of ruthlessness. Like, if you make a mistake, it's, again, ownership. That includes potentially hiring the wrong person. So the ownership of that is, you try and work with them, get them where you want them to go. But ultimately, if you can't get them to where they need to go, you put the company first and go, well, what's the best outcome for the company? And then you would be looking at, how do we try again and get the right person? And this time, what are the lessons learned from that last person? So probably part of the challenge, if you're looking for a co-founder, is it's hard to not bet quite heavily on an individual in that scenario, because they're going to shape your entire product vision. The ultimate challenge for any business is culture is just, most of it comes down to how do people interact with each other. That's the primary challenge in any business. That's what culture is. It's just interactions between humans. You need to find somebody who you think you can interact with in a really constructive way. And it's hard to do that cold. Like, you get maybe an hour or two with a person and you're making that call. You're going to get it wrong. But that's not a problem as long as you're willing to then act on that and fix it. I think the challenge people have is those conversations are really hard. It takes a lot, and you have to be willing to take that step, especially if you're starting a company as a CEO. That's probably one of the main skills you're going to need, how to have difficult conversations and make difficult decisions. There's no shortcut though, I think. Like, you learn how to do it by doing it, which is not pleasant. And if you're lucky, you'll have some people around you who are sort of there on that journey with you, who can help you, which we've been lucky with Kismet, because we had a fairly large founding team. There's always been that support network as we work through problems. You're not sort of there on your own trying to figure out how to solve this stuff. But yeah, hiring is the ultimate open problem. I don't think anyone's figured out how to do it well. They've just figured out ways that are better than other ways.
Yeah, I think one of the best bits of advice that I've ever gotten was James Moody, who I had on this podcast, one of the co-founders of Sendle, and he spoke about how the questions that you have about someone going in that you think that you'll kind of get over, like, they never go away. If anything, they get bigger over time.
That's a good one.
And so either you are like fully convinced about someone and, you then collect data points as you start working with them, or if you have question marks, like, it's just not worth it, because hiring the wrong person is so costly, not just financially, but in terms of the time that you lose of bringing that person on, onboarding them, realizing they're not the right person. letting them go and then having to hire for that role again. There's just a lot of kind of like losses part of that. When you kind of, like you said, some of those technical things are a little bit easier to assess. For non-technical founders, I've found like if you have, again, easier said than done, someone technical who's an advisor or someone who can just like offer to do interviews and just kind of like do 30-minute checks with them is super helpful. On some of more of the vibe / cultural fit stuff, it can be a bit harder to gauge around those sort of things. You know, sometimes people interview well or don't interview well, or it just kind of comes across in different ways. But I guess based on, you know, having hired through sort of multiple iterations of things, what are the specific things that you sort of look for? How do you sort of assess for some of those like softer things, like someone who's humble? How do you assess those qualities?
Yeah, I think the advice that you just quoted too is excellent. I sort of adhere to that now, and I didn't always, of if it's not a hell yeah, it's a no. And one other one I love from Jason Fried is you don't hire someone once, you continuously hire them. So you should be able to look back at a person and ask, if I knew everything I knew now, would I hire this person again? And again, if the answer is not a hell yeah, it's a no. I think that's really important to maintaining a high performance sort of company culture. But to your question, I've only ever had 2 interviews in my entire life where I left and went, this person is a hell yeah. Like it's rare. So the ones that have done it for me are usually people who just are curious about the company. That you can just tell they don't have a lot of ego. Like they're very laid back. They're interested in what you're doing. They want to learn. They ask good questions. They've sort of done a bit of research on the company and they're interested in it. They're not researching you to answer your questions. They're researching you because they want to work someone they genuinely care about. So a lot of that sort of humbleness comes through in they actually care about the space you're in or the mission. Like some of them, one of our employees who started recently, Anna, was specifically leaving her industry to look for something in healthcare. So we came up on the radar because we were in the right space. So she's proactively looking because she knows what she wants to work on. That's a really good sign too. And most of it, like most of my interviews are, I'll go get a coffee with someone and just chat for an hour. They're really informal. Sort of explain our values and culture and see if I can scare them off. That's actually one of the tactics that we employ more than anything. We do our best to scare them off and explain how we work and our values and see if they seem worried about that at all. Especially those ideas of ownership where you will have to do this, this, and this. Some people don't want that. They want a job where they're told what to build and they go home at night and don't think about it afterwards, which is fine. Like that's the career choice they've made, but they're not the ones we're looking for. So if you can sort of highlight the worst possible version of what working here is like, and they're still excited, then that's usually a really good sign. And for us, those people are usually excited because they see the opportunity for growth that's going to be there. They've got a lot of autonomy, a lot of room to learn and grow, try new things. Like if we need to bring new technology into the company, for example, we've just integrated sort of tools like LLMs into our product. We don't sort of hire someone who is a prompt engineer or an expert. We go to someone in the team and go, do you want to learn how to do prompt engineering, and set them loose for the next 2 months? And that's what a lot of engineers, good engineers, want. Like point me at problems, keep me learning. And that's what I'm looking for when I interview engineers. It's, are they hungry to keep learning? Like, do they care about the business and what the business is trying to solve? Because the other thing you want to avoid is people who are hung up on particular technical niches. You know, I'm a C# developer, I'm a back-end engineer. Everyone we hire into the engineering team, I tell them you're coming in as a product engineer, which means you do everything. There's no back-end and front-end. Your job is to build a product and whatever that entails. It could be totally new skills you don't have yet. And there are definitely a group of engineers who are the ones I'm looking for who are excited by that. And what they care about is using technology to achieve business outcomes, not technology for technology's sake. And the way software engineering works too, that you get a lot of the sort of FANG companies have very technical interview processes that are based on algorithms and things like that, stuff you're not likely to actually need in your job, but they're screening for technical skill. I think they underscreen for that sort of values culture piece as a result. And that's probably not an accident. Like they've tuned this system to work for them, but certainly in a small org, like one bad hire can have a seriously negative impact. So hiring for culture becomes like absolutely critical because it's so easy to disrupt and it's so hard to build. So ultimately, I think the short answer for how we assess those qualities is, do they seem like what they want out of their career is just to continue and grow and learn? Is that the main driver for them? And I found that to be the best heuristic for engineers that are sort of aligned with, you know, how I think about what engineering should be.
You kind of spoke a little bit earlier in this podcast about like how there's nothing really that is a technical challenge for you that kind of seems too difficult or too hard to overcome. But I know through like multiple conversations with you and also conversations with Mark, like, I think one of the real challenges, and if you speak to anyone that's kind of building a growing and scaling company, is like people problems. What has that been like for you in terms of some of the challenges that like maybe you have had to face, or things that you weren't really expecting, especially even when you are kind of building a small team, there are still potential issues that come up. So what does that sort of look like internally for you at Kismet?
Yeah. It does sound arrogant when you say there's no technical problems. I didn't mean it as an arrogant statement. They're not the ones I find hard. The people problems are the ones I find hard. This is actually a good topic. So I think the thing I've had to learn a lot in the past 2 years with Kismet, everyone knows starting a company requires sacrifice. Most startups are going to have no cash. It takes a lot of time and effort to build something. Sort of the known quantity kinds of sacrifices. The bit I hadn't quite realized is if you really invested in what you're building, you also sort of sacrifice part of yourself into that thing and sort of give it part of your soul. And you sort of no longer running a company. The company is you. You really are actually investing part of yourself. So things that happen to the company personally affect you, which I hadn't experienced. Like I've worked with a lot of startups, but I don't think I've ever been as deeply invested before. So I've sacrificed in those other ways, but not this way before. I think this is not a founder problem per se. It's a leadership problem. If you're a leader who cares about your people, you're going to sacrifice for them in little ways and big ways. It's paying for a team lunch out of pocket. There's little ways. And one of the challenges you have with sacrifice is it is often invisible. You don't see what people are sacrificing for your sake. And I sort of have realized this, especially in the past year. And I can sort of see it too. I think back and go, I'm sure Mark sacrificed things for me in his career. I don't even know about it. I'll never know about it, but I'm sure it's happened. And other people too. And you start to sort of realize that pattern's playing out across the entire organization. Leaders sacrificing for other people in their team, putting their team first. The challenging part is when people don't see the sacrifice and they sort of take it for granted that they'll get what they want. They don't sort of see there's a counterbalance there of something has to happen to give you what you want. So common examples in startups, for example, you might have an ESOP program. And in order to have an ESOP program, the founders give away part of their equity to the team, which is it's a great thing. You get to include the team on the journey. If you succeed, they succeed. That's the idea. But people don't think about where the ESOP comes from. Like it is being sacrificed by the people who have equity. That sort of counterbalancing information is kind of key in that sense, because if you can identify the fact that someone is giving up something for you, I think the mentality you have towards it is gratitude. They've done something for you. If you think about it in terms of just, I'm owed this, or it's an entitlement, or whatever the framing is, it sort of becomes this sort of opaque thing coming from the company. There's no human element to it. The reality of every business is anything you're given that's more than what's in your employment letter is effectively someone sacrificing. If it's a gift, they've chosen to give that to you. There's always some people who are going to eventually go, I feel like I deserve more. But the challenge as a founder then is, as I said before, you're sort of putting yourself into the company. So that kind of conversation feels like they want to take more of you, which is a weird feeling. And they don't mean it that way, obviously. That's not the intention. But you sort of have to learn to balance those feelings. And it does require quite a lot of strength sometimes to just remember that there's people there who are just looking out for themselves or their family, or they've got things going on in their lives. They're not thoughtless or selfish or anything like that. But it does have a much more personal impact on you, those questions, than if you were to say, potentially running a team in a bigger business. You're not the one who's giving up for your team, potentially. The business is. It's not your personal sacrifice. But that said, I don't think it is a founder problem. I think all good leaders sacrifice something of themselves for their team, if they care about their team. It's what makes them a good leader, though. It's why people end up thinking back on bosses they love. That boss probably sacrificed a lot for them, is why they love that boss. They put them first. And I think that's the right thing for a leader to do as well. So we sort of, I'm not going to say we encourage sacrifice, but we care a lot about leadership in the concept of, it's not about you managing a team or anything. I think you can have a company of 30, 40 people and every single person in that company is a leader. And it's just in the way they show up to work, how they support people around them. If they're stuck on a problem, do they stay late to help them? All these things are leadership. Like it's how you present yourself out to the world and help others around you. And with Kismet, we try to hire people and teach people to become leaders, every single person in every role. Because I think, again, if you're going to build a high-performing team, You need people who are going to be able to deal with like complex, challenging circumstances. They're going to work well under pressure. They're going to be resilient. I think those are all leadership qualities, and they'll carry those with them into the next jobs too. But that skill set, I think, is one that's often learned the hard way. You just have to do it. You have to sacrifice. You have to see it yourself. And the hard part is it's invisible. So you're often just dealing with it. And I'm lucky with Kismet. I'm not on my own. I have co-founders. And I often think back to Mark at Explore, where he was a solo founder, and go, how the fuck did you do this on your own? And you've done that yourself too. So I am sympathetic to you these days in more ways than I probably was in the past. I think that's one of the biggest challenges of running a company, that you do pay a price, but it's not visible to a lot of people.
I love that, because I don't think that gets kind of spoken about enough, especially what you kind of said, like a little bit of your soul goes into the company, and oftentimes it's a lot more than a little bit, and so much of your identity and your life just kind of gets in there. And, you know, I guess speaking of which, like, it's probably more of a personal thing, but like, I remember I was talking to B-Joy last night in preparation for this interview, and we were reminiscing about a story from, I think it was like grade 9 in high school, and the resource center, where you kind of came up to us and you were like, guys, I think I've just, like, you know, found the most perfect music ever. A perfect circle. I never need to listen to new music ever again. I'm done. That's like my music collection done. And, you know, I guess like it's been interesting kind of seeing, you know, as your friend and having worked together and stuff like that, known you for like over 20 years, you know, it's been kind of interesting kind of seeing your evolution. And, you know, we were always very close friends in high school and kind of since, but I think both of us kind of had a lot of that work first kind of mentality. And I think it naturally sort of became that we didn't get to spend as much time together and things like that moving forward. Something I've definitely noticed about you is, like, I feel like you've made a lot of, from the outside looking in, like a lot of changes in that kind of area of trying to like organize catch-ups with us, where like previously it would be a little bit harder for you to do. And, you know, even with your, like, I know with your health and things like that as well, you kind of take that a little bit more seriously too. Like, what was the catalyst for some of those kind of like changes for you, and what does that sort of look like for you moving forward?
Yeah, no, to be fair, Perfect Circle probably still is the greatest band ever.
Dude, I still remember, I was telling him about this, that I would ask you, because my dial-up internet in Jeroboam was terrible, and so I would ask you for like 10 songs to be broadcast with you, like no problem. You would hide those 10 songs in the same like Perfect Circle and like all of these other like music that was not my taste at all. But
I tried to give you good taste. I can't read that. I almost sent you a message this morning saying I'm going to amp myself up and put on some Saliva. What was the question? I got it. So it's an interesting one. I actually think Kismet was a big part of the catalyst, because as we started this company, at the start, it was more of a typical startup kind of situation where I was writing some code. I wasn't invested yet in the same way. It's new. And probably like, I don't know when exactly, 6 months in, bit more. And it sort of clicked that piece sort of fell into place, and it was now an investment. I was there. And that's where I sort of started learning those lessons. But I took the same lens that I've talked about a few times now of ownership. And I went, well, I'm good on that front at work. Am I good on that front in my own life? And the answer was no. Like, exercise got out the window, diet got out the window. You sort of have this mindset of the world is happening to you as opposed to you're happening to the world, I guess. And I around that time, started listening to people like David Goggins.
Of course.
But it put me on this path of, why am I so complacent in my personal life when I'm so good at taking ownership of my work life? So I sort of, once I had that realization, it's one of those moments I can almost divide my life from like pre that moment to after, which is probably a little more than 2 years ago. I sort of remember when it happened. I don't know exactly why it happened. It just happened. And I started to go, well, what are the parts of my life I'm not happy with? What work do I need to do? So I started going to the gym 3 times a week. And I absolutely love going to the gym, it turns out, when I'm doing it regularly. It's very rewarding. Compared to the challenges of work, where it could take months to actually get something done, I can go to the gym and get a new personal best. It's like one record in one day. It feels amazing. But then looking at things like, I've got a really great friend group. Like, why don't I take more time to catch up with them? You know, focusing more on my relationship and how we can improve that. All these sort of different things that you realize you sort of take for granted. And I went, cool, I don't want to be the kind of person taking that for granted. I want to start focusing on that and like deciding how my life is going to go instead of just letting it happen to me. And once I sort of made that decision, it's just, I can't unmake it now. Like, it's there in my brain. And you know, you have better weeks and worse weeks. Some weeks it's hard to keep the mentality. Sometimes it's easy. But I think ultimately it comes down to trying to live life with gratitude and recognizing that everything you've got is effectively a gift. Because the baseline is you have nothing. You've got a terrible life, no money, no home. If you treat your baseline as that worst possible case, then everything extra is a gift. And again, you can't maintain that mindset all the time, but you can bring yourself back to it. And I think about that with Kismet too. Like there's times where I'm frustrated by things, but I also think I work with amazing people. We're doing amazing things, and I can flip that gratitude on and just be, I'm so glad we've managed to actually build this thing, because in all odds, it shouldn't have happened. It should have failed. Usually these things fail. So being able to step back and appreciate what you've got does sort of change how you approach life. And for context, I guess for people listening, very recently, Rohit, myself and Bijoy, who we've mentioned a few times, have decided to catch up like once a week, because we just live all in Melbourne and see each other once every 6 months, which none of us want, but it's very easy to get complacent, I think. So consciously deciding what you value and going after it, I think it's kind of essential. But it is funny, it took me so long to make the same connection in my personal life as I'd made at work a long time ago. And I think it does come back to that idea of leadership, which is not just, again, about managing people or anything. It's about how you show up and present yourself day to day in your own life. So I think having a mindset of leadership, no matter what you're doing in life, does help you actually just keep a good reference frame and like realize what matters and not get lost in everything else happening around you. And I think it's kind of a precipitated change for me. Like a lot of stuff I've sort of been learning over the past few years came together eventually with Kismet, and that sort of kickstarted this in my personal life. But yeah, it's definitely been radically different. Like I can tell how much my life has changed in 2 years. It's pretty crazy. It's not a subtle change. It happened in a very short period of time.
Sender is the OG startup accounting firm in Australia, catering to all stages of your business life. If you're busy running a business, you don't always have the time to do your own books and forecasts, and instead you can fully outsource your finance function so that you have the time and resources back to do what you do best, which is growing your business. They have a dedicated focus on founders, funds, and startups, and have an experienced team that can help you with everything from managing your tax to balancing your books to even helping with your exit strategy. I trust and use them with all of my businesses and can't recommend them highly enough. To find out more or to speak to Gareth and the team, head over to sender.com. All right, let's get back to this episode.
It's funny. I didn't have David Goggins, even though I listened to him a lot. I had a conversation with my mum and sister that kind of gave me the same sort of thing. And I think a lot of that is, you know, I think I've spoken about this before, especially with like the work that we're doing at the Como Club. So much of it is centered around, you know, people in this space in particular. It attracts a lot of people that are very driven, ambitious, want to learn, want to grow. And I think the easiest way to measure that is with your work, where there's a very metrics and charts and things like that you can very easily sort of track. And then, you know, it's unfortunate that like with a lot of other parts of our life, we just assume that if we just coast by, like everything will also follow that same trajectory, but it's never really the case. And yeah, I think it's like you said, like for me, I didn't even realize that I was making those trade-offs for a long time, or kind of justified it in some particular way. But I think once you see it, it's very hard to unsee. And to continuously make those choices after that as well is like you choosing a particular life and path.
Matters a lot.
Yeah. Sorry, just to not like harp on about this, but you kind of mentioned that there's like been significant changes in the last 2 years. Do you want to talk a little bit about like what those kind of changes have meant for you?
I mean, the thing that's changed for me is, I guess, my outlook. I'm not a passenger in my life anymore, if that makes sense. I sort of can look at what I want to achieve and go, cool, here's how I'm going to get there. And that's that sort of intentionality you said. What do I want to have in the future? How do I set myself up to do that? What are my goals? The shift that comes there is basically that you stop letting, I think you said coasting. Coasting is the exact word I'd use, I think, too. It's easy to think that things will work out well if you just do nothing in that situation. I'm trying not to take things in my life for granted, I guess. It's how do you continually bring yourself back to going, is this the best life I can be living? Am I being a good friend? Am I being a good partner? Am I being a good boss? There's limitless growth possible for anyone who wants to do it, but I think you default away from that most of the time. You might do it in one domain of your life, like work, because it's easy. But yeah, I struggle with the idea now of going back to how I lived 2 years ago. I don't know how I sort of coasted so long and just sort of, it's very easy to just get into a pattern and a habit, I think. And it's almost that you need to be able to force yourself to be uncomfortable continuously. So I think in a way what you need to do is seek discomfort. If you're feeling comfortable, you're not pushing hard enough. So I sort of use that now. If everything seems like it's great, I'm probably not pushing hard enough somewhere. It's the interesting one. I don't actually have the answer, to be honest. It's kind of a continual piece now. And like I said, sometimes I'm in the right mindset and can do it. And sometimes I have to bring myself back to it. You can spend, 3 days in a bit of a funk and then you have the right thought and you're back.
Yeah, and I think just to your point, like I think that discomfort we often associate with like, oh, that means you need to work more, all those sort of things. I think the idea is that like these principles apply in other parts of our life as well. And so the discomfort is like maybe it's a conversation that you've been putting off, or it's that self-reflective ownership piece of going like, oh, maybe like I haven't really shown up in my relationships or haven't like kept myself accountable with my fitness or health or all of those sort of things as well that are equally as uncomfortable. It's just, again, the lens that we sort of often put that on is on a business side of things. And I also think it's like, extremely important and powerful to, I think a lot of this kind of narrative is easy to dismiss when, people have had that big exit and, have kind of come off the other side. And it's like, well, of course, they're kind of doing this sort of stuff. They have a bit more time. I think in the craziness of you sort of building Kismet and the rocket ship, like I think it's really important for people to hear that you can do both. And it doesn't necessarily kind of need to come at a cost of, performance with the business. And if anything, it probably helps you perform better.
Yeah, it's exactly it. And I think that's part of what I realized in that process is I wasn't trading work for health because I needed to do more work. It's actually the opposite. If I take care of myself properly outside of work, it lets me be there to show up and do what I need to do at work. So it takes time away from work. Sure, I go to the gym in the morning and I'm out for 2 hours. Or I decide to go sit in the park with my dog or see friends before work. But those things help me actually be a more holistic leader, I guess, in that sense, because I'm taking ownership in all parts of my life. So actually a good analogy that I hadn't thought of it. But at some point at Explore, we had to do one of those compliance video things you end up doing at big companies. And the way I used to approach that was I would put it on my to-do list and I'd set the date on it to be the day before it's due. Because to me, it's not an important thing to do. It's still not really an important thing
I think everyone does, to be honest.
But I was talking to Mark back then, and he sort of framed it differently to me. And he said, if you've got this thing that you need to do that will take you 10 minutes to do, why not just do it? And it's off your list. And it flipped my perspective a bit from being what's urgent to what's not urgent to thinking about discipline more like a muscle. So rather than, being disciplined when I have a big thing to do, just be disciplined about everything you do. And it turns out that those little acts of discipline help you do the big ones, because it's not just something you turn on and off. It's sort of a way you're approaching your life. And I think this is from a book, but you don't have sports players who go, oh, it's just training, I'll skip it. I'll go to the actual game and then perform really well. You have to go to the trainings. So all these moments in life are the trainings for you to build the skills you need to execute on the big hard things. If you get lazy about those things, you won't be able to do the hard thing because you can't do the simple thing. So get those reps in, do the simple things, make sure you can nail the basics and they're easy for you. You don't even think about it anymore. And when you get to doing the hard stuff, you've got the skills you need to do it. And I'm not saying go take cold plunges and get up at 5 a.m. That's sort of a vanity metric component to this, but sort of get your life in order to a point where you think you have a good routine, you're happy with how things are going, you're in shape, you're eating well, you're spending time with your kids if you've got kids, spending time with your partner, having days off, but it'll help you when you actually need to show up because you'll have the energy reserves that you might not have if you're neglecting that other part of your life. You'll have the support of people around you because you've been there for them instead of not ignoring them. I think it's vital. And I think that's probably how I think about this these days, that these things are sort of muscles that you need to just work so that they're there when you actually need them. And the upside is it makes your life better as you go. You're going to be happier in your personal life and you're going to do better at work. And there's not a lot of downside that I found.
Totally. And, extending out that sports analogy as well, elite athletes don't train for 10 hours a day and then kind of go again, to perform at their best when they need to. Yep. You have your rest days and you have, you kind of understand there's the balance of both. And there is such a thing as kind of overtraining, which is counterproductive. But again, we don't apply that sort of same lens for us, especially when it comes to work, because we just assume that more means better. Yeah,
especially in engineering. It's funny because at Explore, I was probably working 60-hour weeks and weekends, and I'd have maybe an hour a day or so where I actually had focus time to do what I would consider real work. So that's maybe 5 hours a week if I'm lucky. And if you take Kismet, I can sit down for an afternoon and do 5 hours of work uninterrupted because we've got next to no meetings. So there's very little distraction. Again, side effect of small teams, you don't need to have lots of meetings. But if you take that over 5 days, it's 25 hours of work, less than a work week. I could get more done at Kismet working 25 hours than I could get done at Explore working 5 weeks, because I'm getting that actual real focus time, which is where I can do my real work, instead of just counting hours and filling out a calendar. And I think that's the thing you actually have to measure. It's not how many hours are you working, it's how much impact are you having. Because some of the people who are struggling the most in their jobs, I find, are working ridiculous hours, 60-hour weeks. But you look at the output and go, well, it's because you're putting your energy into the wrong things. You could do your job in 10 hours if you focus on the parts that actually mattered, but you have to figure out what parts matter first.
Matt, I can talk to you for hours, clearly. But maybe I'll kind of end on this note. Obviously, again, I assume we can't really kind of like share public numbers or anything like that, but Kismet's been on an absolute tear. Very, very happy as an investor, but super happy for you as a friend as well. Obviously, you guys haven't had the exit, but, you're just on this incredible trajectory as a company. What does that kind of success of that sort of meant for you personally? And if anything, has your perspective or anything like that sort of changed at all from pre-Kismet to now?
So the humble answer here is I don't think we're successful yet. I think we're at the start of a much bigger journey. And, I think some people look at valuation and think about exit and how their life will change afterwards. But if I walked away from this with no equity, I didn't get anything besides the salary I've taken while I've been here, I'd still be grateful for the experience. Like, I think to actually get to experience being in a company like this as it grows has been, like, it is literally once in a lifetime. It's very unlikely I'll get to do this again. So for me, I don't think about the next thing afterwards. I'll be perfectly happy to sort of, there's a cool bunch of people here. Like, let's just keep working on cool stuff together for the next 10 years. I think I've never had a huge drive for money. I've had a huge drive to learn and to actually have an impact in the world. The really cool thing with Kismet is I think we can probably do some significant work to make the world better if we just sort of stay on the trajectory we're on now. And that's exciting to have that opportunity. But post Kismet, ideally just hang out with friends more often would be good. Maybe buy a mansion. We can each have a wing. Live the childhood dream.
That was actually the childhood dream that we spoke about. Playing outdoor soccer in the backyard.
Each have a wing.
Yeah, amazing. Matt, like I said, awesome to chat. And like I said, it's been amazing to kind of see your journey both professionally and personally, just as a friend who's kind of known you forever. Super, super happy for you. Super proud of you. For anyone that wants to find out more, say hello, get in touch. What's the best way for them to do that?
You can reach out at hi@Kismet. I don't know. What are the best ways to get in touch?
I assume you don't really check your LinkedIn or anything at all, right?
I do.
Yeah. Oh, you do?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
You've changed. You never did that before. But we'll make sure we add those links in the show notes. Matt, awesome. Hopefully it wasn't too uncomfortable an experience for your first podcast either.
No, and thanks. I've had a similar experience. I've loved getting a chance to watch you grow in your career and overcome a lot of challenges and get to where you are today. It's been awesome.
Yeah, awesome. Great to see you, man.
You too.
Thanks for listening to episode 209 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this episode will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.